Hello, welcome to Delhi, welcome to India. Since I'm not there with you, I thought let me take you around India and the rest of the world. I'm sitting here in a studio in South Delhi, and one of the things that strikes me is how much all of us in India and many of the developing countries in this world live in two centuries. On one hand, we live in the 21st century where there's so much plastics around us. On the other hand, we live in an earlier time where there are so many practices that were embedded in sustainability. Many of you who do know a little bit about India probably think about some of our traditional crafts and you think they're really beautiful, but there's more to that. What they are really is a product of a sustainable lifestyle. These days, a lot of that sustainability is being wiped out. One of the key ways that shows us that our sustainable lifestyles in India, our cultural attributes, are actually being slowly swept away is our use of plastics, particularly disposable plastics. In 1996, the plastic industry told us that it was going to expand really rapidly. It said that it was going to grow at the rate of 10% every year, and 52% of this was going to packaging. Imagine that. 52% of plastics was going to go into something you'd use for a minute and throw away. At that point, many people laughed. They said, how's that possible? Indians are so frugal. We reuse and reuse and reuse. Most of our kitchens have tins that we've bought with food in them, and then we reuse them. We store rice in them. We store spices in them. They go on and on and on. They start fading, but we don't throw them away. We're not into disposables. Now, 15 years later, they're proved wrong, unfortunately. So what we're seeing is this massive explosion of disposable plastics. For example, here's this magazine. Why do you need this magazine wrapped in plastics? Why? What's so contaminating about touching it with one's hand? How does it spoil the magazine in any way? It makes no sense, but it's a way that we've learned to live. Here is another example. This is something called khatta meetha. It's a typical Indian snack. This is stuff to eat. This is stuff to eat. All of these are in pouches in multi-layered packaging that can't even be recycled. The problem is a lot of people say, well, it's good, it's nice, it shows we're on par with the rest of the world. What's the benefit? I'm not that sure, but I know what's the harm. Let me tell you. Firstly, most of it is not going to be picked up because in India, 94% of the waste is picked up and disposed of incorrectly. There isn't enough money to pick up this kind of waste. In big cities like Delhi and Bombay and Calcutta, you might even see some of this. But in smaller places, in villages, traditionally people take all their waste and they compost it. And then what you do with it? You pick up all the plastic at the time when you're sowing your seeds, and you take it, dump it in the corner, and either burn it or let it be. It's going to float around everywhere. What does that mean? Most particularly, it means that it's going to be eaten up by an animal. All across India, you have instances and examples of cows who just died one day and the vets operated on them and found their intestines clogged with plastic bags. They were so clogged that they were choked to death from the inside. You see that in monkeys. You have monkeys who will grab plastic bags and eat them and choke on them. You have stray dogs who eat plastic bags, who bite plastic bags, who play with plastic bags. If you live in a coastal area, then almost certainly you know how bad it is for sea animals, for turtles, for fish, for all kinds of animals whom we don't even know about, when small microparticles of plastic get into the sea and get into their food cycle. We also know something else. We know that plastics actually can break up into very small pieces, but they don't disappear. And when they don't disappear, the only thing that they do is to move from outside, from the external environment to the internal environment, to somebody's body. Usually that's an animal's body. And here's another image of jackals in the Masai Mara in Africa fighting over a plastic bottle that some tourists just threw away. I think what's really interesting to me is that historically, when something happens to animals, it's only an indicator because it means that at the next level, it's going to happen to human beings. So I think that's a writing on the wall. But don't just think that plastics choke animals. A lot of the plastics that we discard actually are really toxic. They could be toxic externally, which means that they would obviously pick up, say, corrosive acids that we use as cleaners. And those things go into the stomachs of these animals, and they can be really toxic. Imagine kind of taking a little bit of some toxic corrosive agent in your drinking water. Would you nibble on something that's got an element of corrosive cleaner in it? Of course not. Why do we let animals do it? Why do we throw these kinds of things out? Plastics also can be inherently toxic, and a lot of them are. For example, PVC. Every time you're throwing out your blister packs of medicines, those are PVC. Somebody's chewing on them. Sometimes PVC, in fact, quite often PVC has additives which can cause reproductive disorders, which can harm the animals. These kinds of dangers are so slow, it's difficult to monitor them. We don't monitor them, but we have enough science to tell us that we are poisoning the animal life around us. But I want to go deeper into this issue of plastics, about our consumption and about what it's really doing to the environment. A lot of you probably already know that plastics comes from oil. And those of you in the north of America have experienced the terrible tragedy of what oil can do to the ecosystem. You've known that firsthand. You've known what oil spills do. That was a large oil spill. You can have small oil spills. And throughout its life cycle, drilling oil, refining oil, transporting the refined products, all of these are really dangerous, and they can actually have, and they do actually have, significant impacts. So the point is that plastics, when you're using plastics, you've already caused some pollution. You already have the baggage of historical pollution with every piece of packaging in your hand. And really, when we open something and just throw it out after 10 minutes, what we're really doing is to throw out a little bit of oil. Tell me, would you take oil out of your car and just throw it down the kitchen sink? I don't think so. I wouldn't. So why do that with packaging? Why use packaging that's so unsustainable? Many people talk of recycling and they say, well, if we could recycle everything, nothing would go wrong with the animals. They wouldn't have to eat it. All we have to do is to collect it. And in cities, we're often told, oh, if you just put all your trash into a trash can, then you don't have to worry. Of course not. Recycling is a good thing, but it's no substitute for reduction. Let's know that. Every time you recycle something, you usually downcycle it, which means you still need virgin plastics to come in and replace that product. Often when you downcycle plastics, it's so cheap that it displaces something more sustainable. And then you have downcycled plastics and you don't have a sustainable product. So I think that yes, in India, in a lot of the developing world, the Philippines, Thailand, Brazil, Colombia, you name it, for that matter, in some of the developing world also, you have a whole sector of people who will pick the trash for you, waste pickers typically, who will segregate it, who will wash it, who will trade it, send it to a junk dealer, who will sell it ahead, and finally it will end up in a reprocessing factory. And it's good because it gives them jobs. They do this work for us for free, and we need to respect that and improve their work. But that still doesn't justify disposable packaging of the kind we're talking about. If the plastics aren't eaten by animals, they're still in our environment. So if you look at a landfill, if you look at a cross-section of a landfill, you're not going to find it just brown as you would expect. It's actually quite colorful. And I'm talking of a landfill in India where most of us reuse most of our things. We don't throw out as much as the United States. Yet you find colors, and those colors come from plastics. So what you're seeing is you're shoving a lot of the disposable packaging in the mud, and if you walk on a typical Indian landfill, it's kind of spongy, like a really thick carpet. And part of the reason is that the mud has got displaced by plastics. And when you try to reclaim that landfill and say, oh well, we're going to have to plant trees and green it, it's actually really unviable. Nothing with deep roots can grow there because they're going to meet with a carpet of plastics right there. And so we've permanently displaced good old-fashioned mud with plastics. At the beginning of this talk, I said, you know, countries like India seem to really live in two worlds. And you must be wondering, what's the two worlds? Because quite clearly, what I'm telling you sounds similar to your lives everywhere else in the world, in the more affluent countries. But what I'm talking about is a life that still exists for many of us, including for me. It's a life where food can still be packed in paper envelopes. It's a life where something like this exists. This is a leaf, and it's got something to eat inside it. And I've bought it in Delhi, right next door to my expensive neighborhood. This is the kind of life that still exists. We still live in a world where we're not that scared of our drinking water glasses. We drink directly from them. We don't need a plastic straw. As India becomes a global power, it shouldn't be picking up the worst attributes of the developed world. We don't want 300 million people in our country to live so poorly that they don't even get a good meal a day. We don't want to be the country with the most number of malnourished children. That's one reason why we shouldn't spend so much of our revenue, $68 billion a couple of years ago, importing oil, some of which goes into plastics. But we need, when we become affluent, and as we begin to become affluent, we need different kinds of role models. To some degree, we need to look within ourselves, look at our own backyards, look at our own sustainable cultures. But to some degree, we need all of you, when you make choices, to make greener choices, to make more sustainable choices. Because when people in wealthier parts of the world do that, it sends out a ripple effect. It sends out a message. It sends out the feeling that it's okay to have less. It's okay not to have everything wrapped in plastic. It's okay to belong to the 21st century and still consume a little bit less. So let me end with this thought that I just left you with and urge all of you to consume less packaging so that all of us and people in our countries that are rich understand how important it is and how all right it is to have less plastics and less disposables in our world. Thank you and bye.